Few people realize that some of the deepest stories in the Bible begin with decisions that seemed simple. Asterisk, a change of city, an attempt to survive. A choice made under pressure. Nothing extraordinary at first glance, but sometimes a decision made in silence inside an ordinary house can change the destiny of an entire family, and even influence events that will only be understood many years later. Curiously, the story that would prepare the way for one of the most well-known narratives of the Bible, asterisk, the story of Ruth, asterisk, begins with a man who is almost never remembered. His name was Elimelech. He was not a king. He was not a prophet. He did not lead armies. He was simply a father trying to solve a problem that seemed too urgent to wait. Famine had reached Bethlehem, asterisk, and when even the house of bread has no bread, asterisk, something is deeply wrong. That was when Elimelech made a decision that at that moment seemed wise, a decision that many fathers might make in his place, a decision that promised immediate survival. He decided to leave Bethlehem, to leave the land of Judah, to take his wife Naomi and his 2 sons to Moab, foreign land. Perhaps he thought it would only be for a while, only until the crisis passed, only until life returned to normal. But the biblical story has a curious way of revealing something we often forget. Some decisions seem small when they are made, but they carry consequences that only appear much later. Asterisk, Elimelech left Bethlehem, seeking to preserve his family. Asterisk, but he never saw the end of the story that his decision had begun. Asterisk, and it is exactly this story, silent, human, and deeply real, that we are going to explore now. There was a time when even Bethlehem had no bread. At first glance, the sentence sounds strange. Asterisk, after all, the very name of that small city carried a meaning that sounded like a promise. Bethlehem. In Hebrew, Bethlehem, literally house of bread. It was a name full of hope, a name that evoked fertile fields, abundant harvests, tables set with food. But there was a period in the history of Israel when that promise seemed to have been broken. The fields dried up. Asterisk, the storehouses emptied. Asterisk, and families began to notice something that no one wanted to admit out loud. Asterisk, the food was running out. Asterisk, it was in this scenario that the story of a man named Elimelech began. Asterisk, to understand the weight of what was happening at that moment, asterisk, it is necessary to look a little more at the context of that time. Asterisk, the story takes place during a period known in the scriptures as the time of the Judges. It was a complicated time in the history of Israel. Asterisk, there was no king. There was no strong central government. Each region was led by leaders raised up at specific moments. The so-called judges. They appeared when the people faced oppression, asterisk, or crisis. The Book of Judges itself describes that period with a sentence that summarizes the climate of the nation. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Asterisk, everyone did what seemed right in his own eyes. This sentence was not only a political observation. It revealed something deeper. Asterisk, spiritual instability. Asterisk, the relationship between the people of Israel and God passed through repeated cycles. The people drifted away. Crises appeared. Asterisk, Then they cried out to God. God raised a deliverer. The people experienced some time of peace, asterisk, until everything began again, asterisk. And in many of those cycles a consequence appeared frequently. In the land of Israel, asterisk famine, the promised land was fertile. But it also depended deeply on seasonal rains. If the rains failed, the crops failed. And when the crops failed, the impact was immediate. There were no supermarkets. There were no industrial food reserves. Asterisk, the survival of families depended directly on what grew from the land. Asterisk, when the wheat did not grow, when the barley did not mature, when the fields remained dry. Asterisk, hunger began to surround the houses. Asterisk, and that is exactly what happened in Bethlehem. Asterisk, Bethlehem was located in the hill country of Judah, a few kilometers south of Jerusalem. It was a small town surrounded by agricultural fields and pastures. Its location made it traditionally connected to the production of grain. That is why the name made so much sense. House of bread. But in that specific moment of history, the house of bread was empty. Imagine the scene. Asterisk, the fields that would normally be covered with golden grain, asterisk, were now dull and silent. The wind passed over the dry land, raising dust. Families looked toward the horizon, waiting for signs of rain. Asterisk, but the sky remained closed. Asterisk, the storehouses began to empty. Mothers had to divide small portions among their children. Fathers walked through the fields trying to find any sign of a late harvest. It was the kind of situation that began slowly and then became impossible to ignore. At first, perhaps someone would say, it is only a difficult year. But when the next season also failed, the tone of the conversations changed. Asterisk, the famine was not only an agricultural problem. It became a family crisis. And it is exactly in this scenario that the Bible introduces a man named Elimelech. Asterisk. The biblical text introduces him in a simple, almost silent way. He does not appear as a king. He does not appear as a prophet. He is not described as a great national leader. He was above all an ordinary man, an Israelite from the tribe of Judah, husband, father, the kind of man who carried on his shoulders a responsibility that every head of a family knew well in that ancient world, to protect, asterisk, and to sustain his household. His name carried an interesting meaning. Asterisk, Elimelech means my God is king. In a period when Israel had no human king, his own name reminded people of a spiritual truth. God was the true sovereign. But names sometimes carry silent ironies, because even those who carry names full of meaning, asterisk, still have to face difficult decisions when life becomes hard. And life was becoming hard. Elimelech was not alone. Asterisk, the Bible also mentions his wife, Naomi. Her name meant pleasant or sweet, and the couple had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Asterisk, a family, a house, a small center of life, trying to survive in the middle of a growing crisis. Perhaps at first they tried to wait. Perhaps they thought the situation would soon change. Asterisk, perhaps they saved the last reserves of grain, hoping the next harvest would solve the problem. Asterisk, but the weeks passed, The months passed, and the famine continued. This kind of situation creates a very specific kind of pressure inside a house. It is not only the empty stomach. Asterisk, it is the silent weight of the decisions that begin to appear. Asterisk, what should be done when the land where you were born no longer sustains your family? Asterisk, how long should one wait? Asterisk, when is it time to act? Asterisk, these questions were not theoretical for Elimelech. They were in front of him every day. Perhaps he watched his sons while they slept. Asterisk, perhaps he noticed that the food portions were becoming smaller. Asterisk, perhaps he spoke with other men in the town who faced the same dilemma. Asterisk, some might decide to stay. Asterisk, others might begin to consider something that for an Israelite of that time, asterisk, was not a simple decision. Leaving the land. Leaving. Judah. Seeking sustenance somewhere else. For a people who carried so deeply the identity of the promised land, asterisk, leaving was not only a geographical change. It was a decision filled with meaning. The land of Israel was not only territory. Asterisk, it was inheritance. It was promise. It was identity. Asterisk, but famine has a peculiar way of transforming theories into urgent decisions. Asterisk, and when a family begins to feel scarcity knocking at the door, asterisk, even the deepest convictions must sometimes be revisited. Asterisk, it was at this moment in the story that a possibility began to appear on Elimelech's horizon. Asterisk, a place beyond the borders of Judah, a foreign land, a region known for another people, a territory called Moab, but that decision was still only forming. It was not yet a step taken. It was only an idea, a possibility, a silent question that began to take shape in the mind of a father who looked at his sons and thought, asterisk, what if staying here means watching them go hungry? Asterisk, the story was still at the beginning. The famine was only the first movement of this narrative. Because sometimes in biblical stories, the initial crisis is not the end of the problem. It is only the beginning of decisions that will change everything. Asterisk, and that is exactly what began to happen with Elimelech. The famine in Bethlehem did not only reveal a lack of bread, it began to press for a choice that would take that family far from home. But that decision still needed to be made, and when it was finally made, the road that opened before them would lead to a place that none of them imagined would forever change the direction of the story. Because sometimes a simple decision for survival becomes the starting point of a much greater story. Asterisk, and that is exactly what happened when Elimelech began to consider leaving Bethlehem. But to understand the weight of that choice, it is necessary to look closely at the moment when he finally decided to depart. And that is exactly what happens in the next moment of the narrative. The famine in Bethlehem did not disappear suddenly. Asterisk, it did not end with an unexpected rain or a miraculous harvest. Everything indicates that the situation continued to worsen. In small agricultural towns like Bethlehem, crises like this were not solved quickly. When the land failed, the impact spread slowly through families. Asterisk, through homes, through the conversations that happened at the gates of the villages, It was impossible to ignore. The reserves were decreasing. The fields were not responding. Asterisk. And each day made the question more urgent. Asterisk. How much longer would it be possible to remain there? Asterisk. It is at this point that the biblical narrative reveals the decision that would change the direction of that family. There was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live for a while in the land of Moab. Asterisk with his wife and his 2 sons. The sentence is short, but inside it there is an enormous decision. The Bible does not describe the conversation that led to this choice. Asterisk, it does not record the days of doubt. Asterisk, it does not report the thoughts that passed through Elimelech's mind as he watched the situation worsen. Asterisk, but it is possible to perceive the weight of the decision when we understand the context. Because leaving Judah was not simply moving to another city, it was crossing borders. Asterisk, it was leaving the land that had been promised to the descendants of Abraham. It was entering foreign territory. Moab. Asterisk, the Moabites had their own history, their own culture, their own gods. The main one was Chemosh, a deity associated with Moabite national power. For an Israelite living in that environment meant entering a spiritually foreign land. Even so, the famine continued. Asterisk. And Elimelech made his decision. He left, but there is an interesting detail in the verse. Asterisk. The text says he went to Moab to live there for a while. Asterisk. This suggests something important. Elimelech probably did not imagine the move would be permanent. Perhaps he thought, asterisk, let us just wait until the crisis passes. When the famine ends, we will return home. But life followed another path. Asterisk. The family arrived in Moab. They found a place to live. They found ways to survive. The famine seemed far away. Years passed. Asterisk. The sons grew. Asterisk. And then something unexpected happened. Elimelech died. The Bible records the moment with only one sentence. Asterisk. Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. No explanation, no details, only the fact he died in a foreign land, far from Bethlehem. Naomi now faced a new reality. A widow, in a land that had never been her home. But life continued. Her sons were still alive, and they began to build their own lives. They married, but not women from Israel. They married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other asterisk Ruth. Years passed. The family lived in Moab for about 10 years. Asterisk, and then another tragedy came. Both sons died, Mahlon died, Chilion died. Asterisk, and suddenly that house was completely different. When they left Bethlehem, there had been a husband, a wife, 2 sons. Now there remained a mother, 2 daughters-in-law, 3 widows. Naomi was far from her homeland, not far from her relatives, without her husband, without her sons. The decision that once seemed like a path of survival asterisk had led to a place filled with loss. But the story does not end there, because one of those women, one of the Moabite widows, would become part of something much greater. Her name was Ruth. A foreigner, a widow, asterisk, someone who in the eyes of many might have seemed unlikely within the history of Israel. But it is precisely through her that God would begin to write one of the most surprising chapters of Scripture. Asterisk, because sometimes what seems to be only a story of loss is actually preparing something much greater. And the journey of Naomi and Ruth is only beginning. Soon a decision will be made. Asterisk, a return to Bethlehem, a promise of loyalty, and a path that will eventually reach the lineage of King David himself. But that is the next part of the story. Asterisk, and if you enjoy exploring the Bible, this way asterisk understanding, the context experiencing every detail and discovering the stories that often go unnoticed asterisk, then continue walking with us. Asterisk, because there are still many stories hidden in the Scriptures, waiting to be revealed. Asterisk, and the next one begins exactly when Ruth decides not to abandon Naomi. This journey is only beginning.